Okay, we're recording. I am Brandon Polite, professor of philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Brian Soucek, who is professor of law and chancellor's fellow in the School of Law at the University of California, Davis. Brian, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So we're talking about your book, which just came out this year, 2024, recently, Permitting Art, Visual Arts and the First Amendment on the Streets of New York, came out by Cabinet Books. And, the title has a double meaning, right? It's permitting art in terms of allowing art to happen, but also permitting in the sense of, legally giving permits for art to be sold and produced, or I guess sold in particular, on the streets of New York City. And so I guess to get things started, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, a kind of embarrassingly long number of years ago, the editor at Cabinet came to me because I'm a law professor who is a philosopher of art first. And he was wanting to start a new series for Cabinet called Art Before the Law, which would, as this book does, combine primary texts from legal cases that have been important to the arts, combine those, sometimes edited. Most of ours are complete, maybe some that are hard to obtain. So in this book, for example, we have 3 opinions, but then also a friend of the court brief that was filed by Chuck Close and a bunch of artists and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other kind of art world luminaries, and that's never been published before. So it would combine the primary text with a long introductory essay that would explain, why this is relevant, why these cases are relevant and important to the arts. And he basically said, if you were to do this, what cases would you choose? And for a while now, I've had this quest to expand the crossover, the law aesthetics crossover, which I think has been primarily dominated by the intellectual property folks. So if you think in aesthetics, we have some great scholars who have done amazing work on copyright and the really hard aesthetic questions that come up within our copyright law regimes. But generally within law, people tend to take that as their paradigm and then come up with sort of easy answers for how to avoid what they see as the problem of law defining the arts or getting involved in aesthetic judgment. And when you only look at it, say within copyright, within IP, people tend to come up with solutions to these problems that I just don't think acknowledge the breadth of aesthetic judgment that goes on in law. So I've been much more interested in my work in how aesthetic judgment happens in tax law and tariff law, in zoning law. It's all over land use law, in historic preservation, in funding decisions, and then in things like this, the book, permitting is really literal. We're talking about a vendor permit to sell on the streets of New York. And there's only 850 of those in New York City. So to get past that logjam, artists needed to assert their First Amendment right to sell without a permit. And these are the kinds of cases that I think make aesthetic judgment unavoidable. And there are also cases which, in a really unnoticed way, have reshaped the streetscape of New York City and other places like that.
Yeah, awesome. So let's dig into the cases that you, include in the book, helpfully in blue, whereas I don't know if the blue's showing up that well, whereas, your essay is in white or
Yes.
off-white or something of that sort, right? So the first case that you include and then dig into in the book is Bery versus City of New York, which first comes up in 1995, then it's appealed, and so talk us through why Bery and other artists were bringing this case against New York back in 95.
Yeah, so this permitting scheme in New York that I was just talking about started in the late 70s. And so it was in 1979 that New York set the limit of non-food vending sales permits at 853, and it's just never changed it ever since then. So that's still the number of permits. A years long wait to get one. Most of the people we see selling on the streets of New York are not doing so legally. People selling, cell phone cases and pashmina shawls and that kind of thing. There had always been an exemption for written material, which was basically thinking of booksellers and newspaper sellers. And then that led to hard questions about, what about people selling calendars? They said no. What about people selling baseball cards? They said yes. What counts as a written material there? But it never included visual arts. And so in 1993, there was something like 100 different arrests of artists on the streets of New York, mostly down around Soho. Some of the local brick and mortar businesses were really pushing their council people to crack down on these kinds of sales, which they thought interfered with the sidewalks and took away from some of their sales. Weirdly enough, a big actor in all of this was Donald J. Trump, local businessman, who at the time was the head of the Fifth Avenue Business Improvement District. And he was working to get not just visual artists off the sidewalks, but trying to get New York to overturn a law that it had that said that veterans could sell. They had a Civil War era law that said veterans could sell on the street. They didn't need the permit. And Trump tried to get that overturned unsuccessfully. So 100 artists get arrested. They bring a federal lawsuit saying we should have the same kind of rights as visual artists that written material vendors have. Our expression is also protected by the First Amendment. They brought both First Amendment and equal protection claims. And it went to this district court judge in Manhattan who, oddly enough, had been the general counsel for MoMA earlier in her career. And sort of unclear how that was going to cut. It seems maybe she's going to be sympathetic to visual arts, or maybe she's just an institutionalist, and these are, literal outsiders. And for whatever reason, it turned out it was more the latter category. She had a just decidedly unsympathetic opinion. She made a sharp distinction between words, which she thought were the core of First Amendment protections, versus visual arts, which she had trouble distinguishing, she said, from, say, the work of the silversmith or the jeweler. So how to treat painting, prints, photography, et cetera, as anything different from any other craft. So for these reasons, she denied their claim. They immediately appealed. And at that point, they got some nice friend of the court briefs. They had that collection, they had that brief from Chuck Close and all the art world folks. And then they had really good briefing from the ACLU. Who added a new argument here. Well, artist side, they made the great point that even when it comes to words, First Amendment doctrine has always cared almost as much about the emotive content of a word as it does the meaning of it. So in cases, famous First Amendment cases like Cohen v. California, which is the guy wearing the jacket that said "fuck the draft" on the back, and he was wearing it in a courthouse. And basically the court said, this is not paraphrasable. We protect his mode of expressing his opinion about the draft as much as the actual sentiment, so please stop the draft wouldn't have had the same force. And the artist made that point. While the ACLU on the other side came in and said, look, to regulate speech, even when you're doing it in a content neutral way, you still have to leave open ample alternative channels of expression. And this basically what amounts to a ban on sidewalk sales doesn't do that, especially in this case, because for these artists who want to sell on the street, the selling on the street actually is part of the content of what they're trying to express. So it's a kind of embodiment type argument that they were making, that the streetness of it all was itself part of the meaning of the work. And so telling them that they could go and try to find a gallery to represent them just doesn't cut it. Not only would that be unlikely, they're unlikely to find one, but even more to the point, selling in the gallery wouldn't have the same meaning. That at least was the argument. Yeah. So the case goes up to the Court of Appeals.
Sorry, I want to interrupt real quick. I have two questions. One is, why why is selling books okay, right? Is it just the mere fact that it's words, right? And therefore words are covered by the First Amendment, and so that's okay. So we allow books, we allow newspapers, we allow certain magazines, baseball cards for some reason, because they have words on them, right?
Mhm.
Versus, visual art, say, or sculpture.
So the city council did that on their own. I think
Okay.
they did that when they did in 1979 with a fear of a First Amendment lawsuit in the background. But that was a legislative decision to carve out written material from the vending permit requirement. It is responding to, what is a very, very long tradition of handbills and selling pamphlets and selling newspapers and, other traditional mediums of expression on the streets. That is clearly a pretty, standard way in which political expression has happened, and where the sales of it has often been a component. The selling of pamphlets, that kind of thing, and of newspapers, of course, has long been seen as not affecting the protectedness of the activity. So it has to be said, there is a bit of a theoretical problem under the First Amendment for how we justify protections for the visual arts, in contrast to written material. So when we think of the marketplace of ideas as a kind of reason, when we think of political self-determination, some quite prominent theorists have said we don't need paintings to know who to vote for, kind of thing. The A theoretical justification for the First Amendment that's grounded more in self-fulfillment or personal autonomy works much better, but that's pretty unbounded because that seems like it is going to work for the silversmith and for the jeweler as well.
Yeah.
So it has long been a problem of how we justify First Amendment protection for the visual arts. So the district court judge wasn't just completely making things up there.
Yeah, right. And so, New York legislates just all books can be sold, right? Presumably, whereas you could think that there could be an argument that they could distinguish between, political pamphlets versus, say, like works of like romance novels or pulp fiction or something of that sort.
You could, and in fact, in one of the early criminal charges, so this was a state criminal charge against one of the artists, Bery, actually, the guy whose name ends up on the case. The state court judge in New York said it's so strange because Bery was making actually political paintings about environmentalism. And the judge said, so you could have a baseball card or something that has no political content at all, and it would be protected, whereas Bery's environmental paintings are not protected. Why should that be? And sure, if the criterion there is political expression, then that should follow. But a point we'll probably come back to. Courts have largely gravitated more towards mediums of expression than they had anything that would require a kind of work by work evaluation, which is seen as just A, constitutionally problematic, and B, kind of inadministrable for. We're going to hear a lot in these cases about the beat cop who has to walk down the street and decide in the moment whether this is something protected or not. Really, one of the only places where we get that kind of qualitative or normative determination of is this good enough for protection is in obscenity law.
Yeah.
One of the few places where having art aesthetic value or literary value is a carve out from something being deemed obscene.
Yeah, so pornography, erotica can't be sold on the street. It needs to be sold in particular locations so that, minors can't be in the presence of it or something of that
There
sort.
could be, laws like that. I'm thinking more of actual criminal obscenity prosecutions, which
Oh, okay.
surprisingly still do happen. And for that, you're protected from that under the Constitution if your work has any kind of not just aesthetic and artistic and literary merit, but also scientific or political merit
Okay.
as well.
Cool. So my second question had to do, and you've sort of started to answer it, has to do with, why Bery and these other artists, right? Why it's essential to their work that it's sold on the street, or at least shown on the street, or viewable on the street, as opposed to, say, in an art gallery or something of that sort, right? Why is it essential? In Barry's case, as you were saying, it has to do with the environmentalist message, right? That, he's trying to get this out in front of the people, right? Not just people who pay to get into an art gallery or something of that sort.
Yeah, I think it was probably true for the named plaintiffs in this case. So two cases got combined, and we ended up with a couple painters, photographers, printmakers, and sculptors. And so the people that were actually there named in the case did seem to have these kinds of concerns. I don't think it's a claim that can easily be generalized to all of the painters who might then take advantage of a favorable judgment here. But the thing is, they lucked out with this argument. It really proved to be a genius argument because when they got to the Court of Appeal, they drew as the judge who ended up writing the opinion was somebody who was visiting from the district court, a sort of pinch hitter. They sometimes borrow someone when they're understaffed. And this was this civil rights icon, Robert L. Carter, who had actually argued Brown v. Board of Education and been Thurgood Marshall's successor at the NAACP. So Judge Carter, more than anybody, seemed to really understand the idea that place, that location, could be an internal part of expression. And it's fascinating to me because in the free speech cases that he cites as background, as kind of throwaways, what would be ordinary throwaway citations, instead of focusing on the arts cases that the briefs had really focused on, he added in cases about sit-ins at lunch counters and at libraries, where, of course, the location is essential to the message. So that really registered with him and became an important part of his opinion. I mean, I agree with you that it seems like it might be a bit of a stretch, but here's what Judge Carter had to say of why it matters. He said, "Street marketing is, in fact, a part of the message of appellant's art. As they note in their submissions to the court, they believe that art should be available to the public. Anyone, not just the wealthy, should be able to view it and buy it. Artists are part of the, quote, real world. They struggle to make a living and interact with their environments. The sale of art in public places conveys these messages." So whether you buy that or not, that became an essential part of why pushing them to saying that they have other choices other than the sidewalk doesn't count as an alternative channel of expression.
Yeah, right. That they could sell their art in galleries. Well, maybe they can't, right? That maybe they're not artists who are lucky enough to get in galleries. And so
no, that's right. They said that, they said no galleries beating down our door. More recently, people have said, well, you could sell online. You could get a veteran to sell your art. You're allowed to show your art and, then have sales elsewhere off of the street. Those are the kinds of alternatives that the city was making. Although the city was also making the claim that this is just merchandise. There is no difference between somebody selling their painting and somebody selling their jewelry or anything else on the streets of New York.
Yeah, or like knockoff Rolexes or something, right?
Of course. Yep. All the things that we're used to seeing on the side of the street. So, in any case, at the Court of Appeals, the artist won, and largely for this reason, the court made a distinction between painting, between the work of the painters, photographers, sculptors, and printmakers as being inherently expressive, inherently communicative, as opposed to that of the jeweler or the silversmith, which could sometimes be expressive but isn't always. And so they sent the case back for negotiations about how this is going to get resolved. And this is where a huge turn in the case happened that I think has really not been understood. So the court says painters get to sell their painting on the street. And when they went back and negotiated with the city, the artists got that changed so that in the final consent decree that the city entered into, their agreement going forward, they said that there was a First Amendment right to sell paintings, sculpture, prints, uh, and whatever, and photography on the streets of New York. So a massive expansion. You know, what the court was saying was, no, artists have a right to sell their work. And here they were saying, no, here's four different mediums where anything goes on the street. So when you walk down the streets of New York now and see people selling, reproduced photographs of the Empire State Building or the John Lennon Imagine Memorial or, the Brooklyn Bridge, like this is why. It's because it's the medium that's protected going forward in New York. So that was a huge change. And so I interviewed one of the plaintiffs there to find out how that came about. And this guy, Robert Lederman, who had been arrested something like 40 times in this period, just himself, he said that there were two things. One, he always believed that visual arts had to be treated like the written material. And when it came to the written material exception, it wasn't authors out there selling their work. It was people that could sell, any number of books. They'd have a whole stand with hundreds of different books. So he thought that needed to be analogous. And two, he just didn't want to give the city the power to define who's a photographer, who's a painter, that kind of thing. He seemed more comfortable with them doing, this is painting than he was with saying, this person is an artist, which the city actually does do in other contexts, like whether you qualify for a Soho live workspace or something like that. There are actual laws that say, no, that's only for artists. And so it is something that gets done, but he didn't want to give them that kind of discretion here.
That's fascinating, right? And so we have this shift then from artists being able to sell their own work, right? And, as they're pointing out, it's not like Tolstoy's out on the streets of New York selling War and Peace, right? It's some, random booksellers. To now it's these particular types of art are now sort of protected in the sense that they are permitted to be sold on the streets of New York without a license.
And deeply unclear how the rationale of the opinion that just purportedly gave this right actually supports what we ended up getting in New York. Certainly, it's the on the streetness of it all seems to have nothing to do with even if it was contestable in regard to the painters selling their own work, it certainly has nothing to do with me going and deciding to sell this photograph that I've printed off of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, right. And why just those art forms? Was it because the plaintiffs, were artists of that sort? Why not? I mean, is it legal to sell CDs on the streets of New York? So music?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question that I should know the answer to, and I just don't. To sell CDs or movies, those weren't ever included in the written material exception.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that, of course, there's words.
Yeah.
And they explicitly lost. So as far as I know, that would have to be part of a case that I'm not aware of.
Yeah.
It's not part of. We have some guidance in the book at the end about it's like a memo kind of printed out on a dot matrix printer here that tells the police what they are allowed, and they say that they do allow songs and movies, CDs, DVDs, audio and videotapes, as long as they're not any kind of unauthorized recording.
Yeah, so they're not bootleg.
But I don't actually know where that exception comes from because it's not from these cases.
Yeah, that's super interesting, right? Okay, so we have these particular mediums protected, right? We shift from books and newspapers and baseball cards to painting, photography, printmaking, to visual arts, right? Because
and that brings us to the last step of the story. So jump 10 years exactly. And there's these two guys, Kevin Santos and an artist named Mastrovincenzo, who came from a graffiti art tradition, although they both had academic credentials as well. They went to Fordham and Pratt, and uh, they were making hats and shirts in what the court described as a graffiti style. So they were painting hats and shirts and selling them on the sidewalks, and they get arrested. And they said, "But we're painters." And the cops say, "No, you're not. You're something else." So that case goes back to the courts. District Court says, "No, you're painters." It goes up again to the Second Circuit, to the Court of Appeals, where they get a less sympathetic judge, Jose Cabranes, who is really forced to answer two different questions. One, does this count as painting? So this is almost like a contract law question, because we've got this consent decree that says painting is protected and the city's agreed to it. So if we can fit these graffiti painted hats and shirts into the category painting, then they're good. Aside from that, they say, well, even if we don't count as that, we should have independent First Amendment constitutional protections for whatever this is that we're doing. This new genre of thing that we're making itself should be protected independently. And the problem was their arguments in making those two different claims kind of ran up against each other. So in trying to say, yes, we're painters, we qualify as painters, what we do is art, the two plaintiffs were really talking up all of their success in galleries. There had been a documentary made about one of them. They had each had exhibits. They said, look, the galleries recognize that graffiti art is art. They've recognized that we are painters. So that was their first mode of argument. They had lots of gallerists and museum curators there to testify about the status that graffiti art has attained. That's argument one. Argument two is just like the argument from 10 years ago, which they have to show that there are no alternative channels of expression. That's why they need this new exemption for them to be able to sell these painted hats and shirts. Well, first step, the court said, this isn't painting. When we're talking about painting, the thing that the city agreed to when it said painting can be sold is what we all think of as painting. It's something on a canvas. And, pulled out some dictionary definitions and all that. The dissent there said, oh, give me a break. Have you ever seen a fresco? We don't need canvases. But the court said, no, the city would have never agreed to this kind of sweeping, more unlimited exception to its permitting laws. That was step one. On the other hand, whereas the artists had won on the alternative channels of expression claim in, 10 years ago, here, they had spent so much time saying, look, every gallery wants to show us, that the court just said, fine, go sell in those galleries then. You don't need us. And not only that, but the court said that it wasn't bound by the kind of balancing that happened in regard to painters and photographers, et cetera. They said, if we're going to talk about whatever this new medium is, these painted shirts, we have to ask how administrable this system of exemptions would be. And whereas, and this is a kind of striking fact, the city came and said, we might have been over-inclusive in what we exempted 10 years ago, but in 10 years until now, there has not been a single lawsuit about what counts as a painting or not. This is, from an administrability standpoint, this regime had been just a huge, huge success. And they said, whereas these painted shirts, how are we supposed to tell which shirts and hats are suitably expressive and which are not? Again, if you're the beat cop walking the street deciding to, whose stuff to seize, who to ticket. And the court agreed with that. It has said, that's right. When we get away from painting as traditionally defined, something on a canvas, pigment on canvas, we're left with this really unbounded set of protections that is going to cause beat cop staff to make some sort of aesthetic judgment that they're just not qualified to make. So those artists lost. And that's more or less where we stand to this day constitutionally in New York. They've gone on to regulate visual arts differently in some parks. So, for example, if you walk down the High Line in New York City, there are actually little medallions in the ground that say spots where not just visual artists, but all expressive vendors, people selling expressive materials where they can vend. And then it's just a race to get one of those each day. But still on the streets, this is the governing law to this day.
Yeah, right. And so with Mastrovincenzo, right, with that case, you make a really good observation in the book about that case. Not merely the fact that their two arguments are at a minimum in tension, if not outright contradictory of one another, right? But the fact that with Bery, the expressive nature of the artworks were, essential to them were the fact that they were sold on the street, and graffiti is a street art, right? And so there's this really easy move to connect their case with the original case, right?
And they don't
That
make it.
they don't make. And it's absolutely
Thank you
bizarre.
for asking that because I should have said that in presenting the case. Yeah, that's huge. For some reason, the graffiti artists fail to make that argument that selling on the street is part of their message, which, as you just said, is exactly what you would expect, where you would expect a graffiti artist to start in their argument. And the only thing that I can come up with, I was not able to talk with them. The only thing I can think of is the Bery plaintiffs had arts focused lawyers, people like, lawyers for the arts, different kinds of nonprofits that were there to work for artist rights. They had them representing them. Mastrovincenzo and Santos were represented by the Street Vending Project, which is, still exists to this day, but really is there to represent, the largely immigrant population that sells food and sells other things on the streets of New York. So they had that kind of more labor focus, whereas the first set of plaintiffs had a much more artist focus. And that's the only thing I can think of because that plays such a strong role in the first case and then is explicitly missing. And the court calls that out, that they make no claim that art is part of their message. And, if you fail to raise a claim, it goes back in some ways to you asking why these four mediums. A federal court is bound, or at least is meant to be bound, by the controversy, the case in controversy before it. And so it's shaped both by the identity of the plaintiffs and their distinct claims and injuries, but then also the arguments that they happen to raise. The court isn't supposed to, in most cases, be making their own arguments here. So if you fail to raise an argument, you waive it. And that's what happened here, which is really kind of astonishing.
I mean, could it be possible for them or other artists to appeal or sue the city again, or bring another case against the city, making that argument to connect it up with Bery?
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible that they could say that this is just a different category of art. I think it's going to be unsuccessful in that I don't think courts haven't shown much interest in making that kind of judgment at what I'd call the retail level rather than the wholesale level. And strange as it is, the fact that they were able to make it on the wholesale level back in Bery in the 90s made it seem as if, oh no, this is just something about painters selling on the street, as opposed to we need to evaluate each painting as we walk down the table in order to see whether it's somehow has its meaning, an embodied meaning that includes streetness. That's not the kind of thing that retail judgment is probably not the thing any court's going to want the beat cops to do.
Yeah, and I do feel like the fact that it's T-shirts does problematize the case, right? Because and particularly with reference to the beat cop, right? That how can you tell that this is appropriately expressive versus some other T-shirt? And the fact that you're shifting from graffiti, which is on the street, to T-shirts being sold on the street but meant to be worn off the street and on the street, right? It does make it feel more like merchandise.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, obviously fashion is expressive, obviously T-shirts have messages that are, there's so many tough boundary drawing problems here of how to deal with, you can't it, you get into trouble very quickly when you're looking at is something suitably expressive to have its own kind of First Amendment protection. The court in this case ended up giving us a test that looked at things like, what's the difference between the price of an ordinary T-shirt and a T-shirt that has Mastrovincenzo's graffiti on it, that kind of thing. Do the expressive elements predominate over the kind of shirt features or hat type features of it? How much more is cost increased? The one thing that what they refused to do, they said to determine expressiveness, you have to look at the object itself. What we don't care about is basically the resume of the artists. So as much as they tried to talk up their, I went to Pratt qualifications, Judge Cabrera said, no, nobody cares about that. That's not what makes your work expressive or not. So there is a test for this kind of thing. But again, it's a test that is meant to happen at the wholesale level rather than the retail level.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's broaden things out a little bit, right? There's a point that you make in the book a few times that we don't want the government or the courts to be in the business of defining what is art, right? And, this is something that people like you and me and other people who work in aesthetics have been struggling with for a very long time, right? Attempting to define art, and there seems to be no real consensus among the experts, right? At least in philosophical aesthetics. And so why shouldn't courts then intervene and say, you know what, you philosophers aren't doing your job, you artists and people in the art world aren't doing your job, so we'll do it for you. This is what art is, and give us a legal definition of art.
Well, there's a lot there. So first off, this is one of any number of cases where it's a bit rich for people to come and say, for the people involved in these sorts of cases, to come and say, as they do at different times, I don't want the government involved in deciding what is art. Because after all, the whole reason we're here is because an artist is claiming an art exemption from the law. So I have this article coming out in a couple of months that's about the role of tax law, especially federal tax law, in defining what we think of as arts versus mere entertainment. And there it's the same kind of thing. People were seeking various exemptions from, in this case, the federal admissions tax, which got very high, 30% during World War II. That would tax cabarets and admissions to other, to operas, to theaters, et cetera. And they would say, oh, no, we're the symphony, we should be exempt. And then in other cases, when people didn't get the exemption, they said, how dare, we're making the tax man the judge of what's art. But, of course, you can't get an arts exemption without giving the government the power to define what is art. It's not an exemption if everybody has it. So that's sort of proposition one here is, as resistant as we might be, we're often in positions where we actually think, wow, no, I love government funding for the arts or something like that. Or, I want a kind of zoning, aesthetic zoning in my neighborhood to preserve the character of my neighborhood. But all of these are going to be ways that we're giving the government the power of defining and enforcing. Okay, that's step one. Two, I'm not sure that even if we philosophers of art had done our job and come up with a knockdown definition that everybody agrees to, it's still not clear to me that even there, the law should necessarily accept whatever we came up with. And this, to me, is one of the most interesting and difficult questions in the crossover between philosophy of art and, aesthetics and law. That there are places within law that I think the government should be deferring to experts, to the kind of state of the art about how to define something. And then there are others where art is being defined, or different arts are being defined for a very particular purpose. Why are we exempting sculpture for purposes of tariff law rather than shaped, formed items of metal? Artists pushed for that, which you could never imagine domestic automakers going and saying, "Oh no, let foreign automakers in, for free." But the artists said, "No, absolutely, you should, because A, it will improve the quality of connoisseurship in the U.S., appreciation in the U.S. to have the great works of Europe, in this case, coming in duty free." But also, basically, they believed in a theory of genius and thought there's not going to be competition because the spark of genius, if it hit in France, it's not as if that's going to, we can't get the same thing here. And so they end up with a set of rules that allow in sculpture. That really responds to the purposes of tariff law specifically, which is protecting domestic industry. If there's no competition, no need to have the tariff. I think often funding schemes, government funding is not just looking at the arts in general, but might want to promote a certain type of art, or not promote certain types of art. So it's just not clear that we always want to import expert views. Now, on the other hand, I think if, let's say in copyright law, where we're looking at whether two works are substantially similar, there I actually would want an esthetician to come into court and explain Danto to the court, right? To say, no, it turns out that substantial similarity isn't something you get just by looking, that we can have indiscernibles that are completely different as works of art with very different meanings, different identities. And so there can be progress in the arts, even though the two, point one and point two look the exact same. That is a place where I think, oh, absolutely, we would want to draw on expert opinion. But sometimes I'm not sure that we do. Okay. Even Danto seemed to think that when it came to something like public art, the expertise of the esthetician was going to run out at a certain point because the needs of the public weren't subject to, he was thinking of Stella's Tilted Arc at that point and said, the public has its needs. The public wants to be embodied in its public art and deserves to be. And it doesn't need just an art world set of experts telling it what the best public art should be. They can tell it what the best art is, but not what the best public art is. So that's proposition 2, I guess, that even if we were settled here on what is art, still an open question whether we think the law in a particular context should apply our definition or not. All that said, I have come down, when I started writing this book a long time ago, started thinking seriously about these cases, which I've written about in a few different contexts. I was pretty disdainful of the second opinion, the Mastrovincenzo opinion, and it's really easy to be dismissive of it because for anybody that's, has knowledge of the contemporary art world, it just seems so tradition bound. Like, oh, why is it that we're just going to be protecting like easel painting? That's not where the art world is right now. These medium-based protections, are you kidding? The whole art world is concerned with, busting out of those kinds of medium-based constraints or crossing over them. And so something seems inherently conservative about it, seems really disconnected from current practice. And of course, under the First Amendment, we should want to be protecting the avant-garde. We should want to be protecting, people that aren't operating in the most traditional and kind of institutionally respected ways. And so there's a real concern about that. And over time, I've really flipped on that. I've come to, in many ways, deeply appreciate what these cases are doing by trying to focus on traditional mediums of expression. It's going to have these dangers. It's going to be a bit backward looking. But the alternative that we've increasingly seen, instead of protecting medium by medium, is to protect art, an umbrella category of capital A art. And I have worries both about the definitional problem that you just raised. And although we don't have, perfect definitions of painting or something like that, we have experts on painting and experts on opera in a way that we don't have experts on capital A umbrella category art. We have practitioners of those things in a way we don't capital A umbrella category art. And, you know, it's still going to be tough line drawing, but when you get some weird new thing, that when you get Fountain, in 100 years ago, like questions about whether it's sculpture or not, but not questions about whether it's an opera or a poem. So we actually can make some more distinctions there. And I'm just generally kind of moved by Dom Lopez type arguments, buck passing arguments about our, including some of those that I just said, our Dom's arguments about why we might be more successful passing the buck from what is art to, what are these arts and what counts as examples of these various individual art forms. I actually think that corresponds better to the existing case law. And then my biggest worry is that in talking about capital A umbrella category art, we end up with a lot of claims that we're seeing in law in recent years by, say, cake artists.
Yeah, good. That's where I wanted to take us. Perfect.
Yeah, sure. So in cases like Masterpiece Cakeshop, we've got a baker outside of Denver who doesn't want to serve gay couples, or at least doesn't want to serve two men or two women that are getting married. He doesn't want to provide them a wedding cake. And case goes to the Supreme Court. He's had several, Jack Phillips, the cake baker, has had several cases now. And he starts off, look, my place is called Masterpiece Cakeshop. His brief starts, Jack Phillips is an artist. He's a cake artist, and lots of amicus briefs explaining just why his work is artistic. And those are the kinds of claims that we see now. We see it from florists. We even see it from retailers. We see it from people like Abercrombie and Fitch has made this argument where they said, we provide a theatrical experience, an immersive theatrical experience in our stores. And that's why basically we shouldn't have to hire too many Black people, or we shouldn't allow people that have religious reasons for having head coverings, because they'll ruin the theatrical magic. And people have said in multiple different kinds of briefs to the Supreme Court at this point, should Lin-Manuel Miranda have to start casting white people as George Washington and Hamilton? You'll ruin the point of the artwork if you enforce your ordinary race or gender discrimination laws in the context of these artistic endeavors like cake art and Abercrombie and Fitch stores. And coming at it from that direction, which is really kind of central to my work in law, I'm deeply concerned about a claim that the cake is art, not necessarily because it's sculpture, but it's sculptural. There's claims about musicality, about theatricality, which strikes me as a little more of a metaphor than a categorization. And yet that's really the cutting edge of the claims that we're getting here. And again, the umbrella category of art, which can include, installations and performance art and things like that, really has this sweep to it that I worry is not going to be cabined in the way that I think we need in order to preserve the mere possibility of anti-discrimination law in this country.
Yeah, right. And just so many of those arguments feel like total bullshit, right? Like we at Abercrombie and Fitch, give this immersive theatrical experience. I remember walking by that store in the mall back in the day and continuing on walking because it's it's too loud and just bright and flashy in there. So screw them.
Theater's not for everyone, Brandon.
I know, right? I guess,
Philistine.
I'm too lowbrow for them, I think.
But the claims are fairly sweeping. Disney's making a claim right now. It had fired an actress in one of its Star Wars show, Mandalorian or something, because of some political comments that she had made. And California has an anti-discrimination law against discrimination based on political affiliation. And Disney said, "Oh, we're not subject to that because we're creating an artwork here, right? This TV show, and being forced to have somebody that we don't want that comes with this kind of baggage apparently would change the work that we're creating." And that's a real stretch to me. I'm not sure that we're meant to think when we see the work. Some works, yes, I think some works play off what we know about the actors that are in them, and give it part of the punch. But I'm not sure that in a case like that, or maybe I would want to hear more from Disney about why they think that that is internal to the meaning of that work. Um,
Yeah,
in the
that
same way that I wanted to hear more from The Bachelor, which said we're not subject to suit for the fact that we've never cast a black bachelor or bachelorette in the first 24 seasons of the show. This is our work and we get to express whatever we want through it. And I actually agree with that if they're willing to stand up and say, yeah, this is a racist dating show. This is a kind of white supremacist dating show. If that's the expressive work they want to make, then I would give them the right to do that. But I don't want, to have their cake and eat it too here, right? I don't want them to be able to stay away from that kind of claim, but then also say that they have expressive freedom to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, right. They could get their cake at Masterpiece Cake Shop.
Exactly. So I am concerned about this, and I think that for all the worries about medium-based protections, like we got in these cases, there's one huge advantage, and it's this: it's that mediums are differentiated in large part by their materiality. And the materiality of an artwork is the thing that the law is most likely, or at least legitimately, wanting to regulate. So when it comes to the materiality of architecture versus poetry, or music versus, like, there are major differences there in terms of how much governmental regulation seems appropriate. Right? We have reasons for regulating architecture, or put a different way, bad architecture has dangers that bad poetry doesn't share. Not just that it can fall on you, but also it's unavoidable. Even it's unavoidable in a way. So if we talked about size regulations, they make sense in architecture. Volume restrictions
Yeah.
make sense in music in a way that size regulations for a novel is just going to be inherently, censorship, right? No novels longer than 300 pages or something. That's not equivalent to saying no buildings taller than the U.S. Capitol dome. And so being able to tailor our exemptions, because that's how I think of these, as art exemptions, kind of like religious exemptions that we're used to. It's artists claiming, oh, because I'm an artist, I shouldn't be subject to generally applicable laws. I'm against the claim in that form. Because I'm an artist, it follows that I should get this exemption. But on the level of medium, when we talk about traditional mediums of expression, I think in part what we're talking about are these forms that expression, including but not limited to political expression, have taken historically, that have been really important to us, of how we communicate and do politics and all of that. But also, they tend to be mediums that are, I refer to in my work as kind of expressively efficient. They do the expression with a lot of without a lot of material remainder. And so, a poem is very expressively efficient. There's not much but expression in it. Whereas some of these other things like cakes and architecture are expressive, to be sure, but they also have these kinds of material dangers that poetry doesn't have. And so we have good reason, I think, for treating regulation of poetry and signs, handbills and that kind of thing differently than other sorts of, than our wedding cakes, et cetera, our Abercrombie stores. Retail stores just aren't a traditional medium of expression. That's not normally how we've done politics, even accepting, of course, that what we buy is inherently political, that there are tons of messages that, we come to expect our corporations to have certain politics and all of that. All of that can be true without saying that, yes, so a store is just like a parade and you get to choose who can be involved.
Awesome. I think on that note, we'll end the conversation. So, Brian, thank you so much for talking to me. The book, once again, Permitting Art, Visual Arts and the First Amendment on the Streets of New York. It's a terrific book. Check it out. So, Brian, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Thanks.